A live picture from New York this afternoon as the UN Security Council is about to convene an emergency meeting regarding the most recent chemical attacks in Syria. USA Today says at least 42 people died. 500 were injured late Saturday in the town of Douma, many of those people while sheltering in basements during an artillery and bombing attack. The paper adding that this would be at least the 8th attack of its type since President Trump took office, and the worst since the president launched a military strike at Syrian government forces last April. Again, the UN Security Council meeting to discuss that attack. It is set to get underway here in just a moment. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
The 8,225th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security, the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Staffan de Mistura, the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Syria, and Mr. Thomas Markram, Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. It is so decided. Mr. de Mistura is joining via video teleconference from Geneva. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Staffan de Mistura. You have the floor. Thank you very much, President.
Mr. President, this emergency meeting of the Security Council underscores I'm sorry, I'm hearing my own interpretation here.
Okay, now?
Could I start again then? Thank you. The emergency meeting of the Security Council underscores the gravity of events in recent days in Syria and their severe consequences for civilians, and takes place in a moment of increased international tensions, drawing in national, regional, international actors into dangerous situations of potential or actual confrontation. It is an important Security Council session, Mr. President. There is an urgent need for this Council to find a way to address the situation with unity and purpose. How did we reach this point? March saw devastating violence in half of eastern Ghouta that resulted in at least 1,700 people killed and injured in opposition-controlled areas, and dozens killed and injured in government-controlled areas, and ultimately the evacuation of 130,000 people, including fighters, family members, and other civilians. But in Douma, there was a fragile ceasefire that held for most of March, and the UN good offices did play an important role in that regard. But from the 31st of March, the UN was not able anymore to be involved in talks, since at that time the Syrian government did not consent to our presence, though we have made efforts to propose concrete ways to address issues that we understood were coming up in continuing contacts, including suggesting to activate the Astana detainee working group, but this suggestion at that time was not taken up. From 2nd of April, the evacuation of some 4,000 fighters, family members, and other civilians from Douma to northern Syria did take place. But then, on the 6th of April, there was a major escalation in violence. There were reports of sustained airstrikes and shelling on Douma, killing of civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and attacks damaging health facilities. There were also reports of shelling on Damascus city, reportedly killing and injuring civilians again. Jaish Islam requested our involvement in emergency talks in extremis, but there was no positive response to that when they conveyed to the other side same message. On the 7th of April, at around 8 p.m. local time, reports started emerging of an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma. Pictures immediately circulated on social media showing what appeared to be lifeless men, women, and children. NGOs on the spot, on the ground, claimed to have received hundreds of cases of civilians with symptoms consistent with exposure to chemical agents. The same NGOs claimed that at least 49 people were killed and hundreds injured. I wish to recall what the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, had noted, and I would like to quote him, that the UN, quote, is not in a position to verify these reports, but he has also made very clearly that he cannot ignore them. And, I quote, that he is particularly alarmed by allegations that chemical weapons have been used against civilians, population in Douma once again. And further emphasized, and I quote, that any use of chemical weapons, if confirmed, is abhorrent and requires a thorough investigation. I note that a number of states have strongly alluded or expressed suspicion that the Syrian government was responsible for the alleged chemical attack. I note also that other states, as well as the government of Syria itself, have strongly questioned the credibility of these allegations, depicting the attacks as a fabrication and a provocation. My comment, one reason more than for a thorough, independent investigation. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has said that it has made preliminary analysis of the reports of the alleged use of chemical weapons and is in the process of gathering further information from all available sources. My colleague who is sitting with you, Thomas Markham, Deputy of the High Representative for the Disarmament Affairs, will further address this matter. But I urge the Security Council, in accordance with its own mandate, to maintain international peace and security and uphold international law, to, for God's sake, ensure a mechanism is found to investigate this allegation and attribute responsibilities. Returning to the narrative of the events, at around midnight of the 7th of April, hours after the alleged chemical weapons attack, Jaish Islam informed the UN that they had reached an agreement with the Russian Federation and the Syrian government. The Russian Federation Ministry of Defense stated that the agreement encompasses a ceasefire and Jaish Islam fighters laying down their arms or evacuating Douma. The Russian Federation also reported that up to 8,000 Jaish Islam fighters and 40,000 of their own family members were to evacuate. As a brief view now, we understand that additional evacuations from Douma are already underway. We have also received reports that some detainees, the ones we had heard before, have begun to be released from Douma today. We do note reports that the agreement provides for civilians who decide to stay to remain under guarantees of the Russian Federation, with the resumption of services in coordination with a committee of civilians locally. I urge the Syrian government and the Russian Federation to ensure protection of those civilians so that as many civilians as possible can stay in their homes if they choose to, or leave to a place of their own choosing, or return as per international law. And I urge that there will be, or there should be, an immediate refocus for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2401. What we have seen is basically a escalation before a de-escalation. Mr. President, clearly the dangers of further escalation arise from situations beyond Ghouta as well. We have received reports of missiles targeting the Syrian government Tias or T4 air base early this morning. No state has claimed responsibility for this reported strike. The United States and France have explicitly denied any involvement. The Syrian government, the Russian Federation, and Iran have suggested that Israel could have carried out the attack, with Iranian state media reporting over a dozen military personnel being killed and injured, including 4 Iranian military advisors. The government of Israel has not commented. The United Nations is unable to independently verify or attribute responsibility for this attack. But we urge all parties to show the utmost restraint and avoid any further escalation or confrontation. We are also concerned at dynamics in other areas of Syria. Syrians in Dara, northern rural Homs, eastern Halamun, Hama, and Idlib have all expressed to us their own fears that they may soon face similar escalation to what we have seen in eastern Ghouta. We urge therefore this Council and the Astana guarantors and those states involved in the Amman efforts to work towards reinstating the escalation in these areas and elsewhere in Syria. The indications are the opposite at the moment. Meanwhile, further to its operation in Afrin, the Turkish government has indicated the potential for further operations in other areas of northern Syria if PYD and YPG forces are not removed from those areas. Military operations in such areas have the potential of international tensions, and we therefore urge all parties concerned to de-escalate, show restraint, and find through dialogue means to implement 2401 and fully respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. Let me also highlight that we have seen recently, and this is particularly tragic, when you look at the efforts of all of us, all of you, in the last year, seen recently ISIL launch new operations in Syria, inside Syria, in south of Damascus, rural Damascus, in remote areas near the Iraqi border. Mr. President, let me conclude with some bottom lines, if I may. First, civilians are paying a heavy price for military escalation. We are not seeing the escalation, we are seeing the contrary. Today, our first priority must be protect civilians from the war, from the conflict, from chemical weapons, from hunger. We call on all sides to ensure respect for international humanitarian and human rights law, including humanitarian access across Syria to all people in need. And we urge once more concrete respect of Resolution 2401 throughout Syria, your resolution. Second, continued allegations of use of chemical agents are of extremely grave concern. These allegations must be independently and urgently investigated. Any use of chemical weapons is absolutely prohibited and constitutes a very serious violation of international law, Chemical Weapons Convention, Security Council Resolution 2118. Preventing impunity and any further use of chemical weapons and upholding international law must be an utmost priority of all members of this Council. Third, I have to say it very slowly because it's the first time during my presentation over 4 years of my own briefings that I've reached a point in which I am expressing a concern about international security, not only regional or national or Syrian security. Mr. President, dear members of the Security Council, recent developments carry more than ever before the dangers that the Secretary-General has warned about recently at the Munich Security Conference. He spoke of Middle East, of quote-unquote different fault lines that are completely crossing each other and interconnected, of conflicting interests of both global and regional powers, and forms of escalation that can have absolutely devastating consequences that is difficult for us to even imagine. The Council cannot allow a situation of uncontrollable escalation to develop in Syria on any front. Instead, it must find unity and address the concrete threats to international peace and security in Syria today. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry to have been short, but focusing on one specific concern, the threat to international security related to what we are seeing now in Syria, and on the danger of repetition of the alleged chemical weapons attacks. Next time, I will be able to give you a briefing about humanitarian issues, about other aspects, about the political process, which I know we all are interested and focused on, but today is the day of security, international security and peace. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al señor de Mistura por su muy
briefing,
informativa
which was very informative and enlightening.
Doy ahora la palabra
I
al
now
señor
give the floor
Thomas
to Mr.
Macron.
Thomas Markram.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today. The High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mrs. Zumi Nakamitsu, is away on official travel. Mr. President, it has been less than a week since I last briefed the Council on the issue of chemical weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic. In the intervening period, new and deeply disturbing allegations of the use of chemical weapons have come to light. Over this past weekend, reports have come in regarding the alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma in the Syrian Arab Republic. According to reports that came in yesterday, it is alleged that at least 49 people were killed and hundreds more were injured in a chemical weapons attack. Others, more than 500 individual cases, reportedly presented with symptoms consistent with such an attack. The Office for Disarmament Affairs has been in touch with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons on this matter. The OPCW, which implements the Chemical Weapons Convention to which Syria is a state party, is gathering information about this incident from all available sources through its fact-finding mission. Following the completion of its investigation, the FFM will report its findings on this alleged attack to the states parties to the convention. Mr. President, there is sadly little to be said today that has not already been said. The use of chemical weapons is unjustifiable. Those responsible must be held to account. That these views have been stated before on many occasions does not lessen the seriousness with which such allegations are regarded by the Secretary General. Nor does it lessen the truth behind them, which is what we are seeing in Syria cannot go unchallenged by anyone who values the decades of effort towards bringing about the disarmament and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As the body charged with the maintenance of international peace and security, the Council must unite in the face of this continuing threat. The Council must fulfill its responsibilities. To do otherwise, or simply to do nothing, is to accept, tacitly or otherwise, that such a challenge is insurmountable. The use of chemical weapons cannot become the status quo, nor can we continue to fail the victims of such weapons. Just over 1 year ago, in responding to the attack on Khan Sheikhoun, the Secretary General called for those responsible to be held accountable, stating that there can be no impunity for such horrific acts. Just over 1 week ago, speaking on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, I noted that unity in the Security Council on a dedicated mechanism for accountability provided the best foundation for success in this regard. I reiterate that belief here, as well as the readiness of the Secretary General and of the Office for Disarmament Affairs to assist. I thank you for your attention.
Doy las gracias al señor
I
Markram
thank
por
Mr.
su
Markram
informativa
for
exposición.
his very informative briefing.
Daré ahora la palabra
I
a
now
los miembros
give the
del
floor
Consejo
to
que
those
deseen
council
formular
members who wish to make
declaraciones.
statements.
Doy la palabra
I
al
begin by
representante
giving
de la
the floor
Federación
to
de
the
Rusia.
representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, sir. Sir, if you believe it is a great pleasure for me to speak about the issue that we will talk about now, to make a statement on the side, then you are mistaken. But unfortunately, the situation is such that I will have to say a great deal today, and it will be incumbent upon you to listen to what I have to say. We are grateful to Mr. de Mistura for his briefing, as well as to Mr. Markram. The Russian Federation called for this meeting to be held on the agenda item, threats to international peace and security. Insofar as we are deeply alarmed at the fact that in a number of capitals, above all in Washington, and those blindly following it, London and Paris, there was a deliberate policy undertaken to stoke international tensions. The leadership of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and of France, without any justifications and without considering the consequences, have engaged in a confrontational policy against Russia and Syria, and they are prompting others to follow suit. A broad arsenal of methods is being leveraged: slander, insults, hawkish rhetoric, blackmail, sanctions, and threats to use force against the sovereign state. Russia is being unpardonably threatened. The tone with which this is being done has gone beyond the threshold of what is acceptable, even during the Cold War. Such boorishness against my country is something which your predecessors did not take the liberty to undertake. What is next? We recall a rhetorical question which the Russian president put forward in 2015 from the United Nations General Assembly to our Western partners, above all the United States, concerning their reckless geopolitical experiments in the Middle East. Do you understand now what you have done? And the response at that time hung in the air. But there is a response. No, you do not understand. Just as you fail to understand what you are doing now. The lack of a clear strategy on any issue is appalling not just to us. It confounds not only us. This is confounding to the majority of those seated here. But they have decided not to openly put this forward to you, following you everywhere you go, regardless of everything you touch. Chaos is left behind, in the brackish waters of which you try to take out something. But only mutant fish are being taken out. I will put another rhetorical question forward. Do you understand the dangerous threshold towards which you are bringing the world? One of the areas where there's hostility that is most stark, that is on Syria. The terrorists and extremists supported by external sponsors are enduring a defeat there. Let us recall that we are talking about those terrorists and extremists who you supplied, financed, and deployed in the country to oust a legitimate government. And now it is clear why this is causing hysteria among those who invested political and material capital in these dark forces. Recently, thanks to the efforts undertaken by Russia, in line with the implementation of Security Council resolutions, a large-scale operation has been undertaken to lift the siege of eastern Ghouta. Its residents, for a number of years, were forced to endure the mockery and torture of fighters. More than 150,000 civilians were evacuated from that Damascus suburb, purely voluntarily, with the requisite security conditions being provided. Tens of thousands of them have already been able to return to the liberated areas, and many met with their relatives. There has been no change in democratic composition, which is being shouted about by supporters of the Syrian opposition, has occurred. These are lies. With the leaders of armed groups, there were difficult negotiations that took place. As a result, many of them left the areas they had occupied with full respect for guarantees for their safety. Incidentally, during these transportation operations, several attempts were undertaken to stage terrorist attacks when the militants attempted to reach the buses with the Shahid belts. Others prefer to settle their status with the Syrian authorities. Thanks to presidential amnesty, they now will be able to return to civilian life, and subsequently it is possible they may enter the Syrian security forces. We're talking about implementation of a UN principle in demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. However, this positive dynamic is not to the liking of some. Foreign sponsors through Western countries were willing to take up any straw just to maintain a hotbed of terrorist resistance at a striking distance from the Syrian capital. This for the fighters to continue to terrorize ordinary civilians, to seize their food, and to request from the to beg of the international community that humanitarian assistance be delivered. Incidentally, they were not prepared to share medicine with ordinary civilians, as was shown in the inspection of the strongholds left behind by the fighters. As was the case in the past in eastern Aleppo, improvised hospital facilities in basements were full of medicine, which, as a result of sanctions, Western sanctions, were not provided to Damascus and other government-controlled areas. Also, large storage heights were found, as were the bodies, the corpses of people who had been subjected to torture. We are stunned at the scale of the tunnels that were being used by jihadists, and some of them, small trucks were able to freely move about. These surprising underground facilities brought together the positions of groups who were viewed by some as moderate, and they were linked to the strongholds of Jabhat al-Nusra. On 6 April, the new head of Jaish al-Islam, following instructions of sponsors, derailed the evacuation of the fourth party of fighters from Douma and resumed the rocket and mortar firing against residential areas in Damascus. The firing targeted Mezze 86, Ish al-Vurur, Abu Rumana, and Umayyad. According to official information, 8 died, 37 civilians were wounded. Unfortunately, we failed to see statements from Western capitals condemning the shelling of a historical district of Damascus. The following day, 7 April, fighters accused the Syrian authorities of dropping barrel bombs with toxic substances. At the same time, the versions were being mixed up. It was either called sarin, times chlorine, or at times a mix of toxic gases. Based on a well-known scheme, these rumors were immediately taken up by those financed by Western capitals. I'm referring to NGOs and the white helmets who are mendaciously acting under the cloak of health professionals. And these reports were also taken up and transferred to media outlets. It behooves us once again to state that many of these dubious opposition structures have a clear list of the email addresses of representatives of Security Council members, which shows that some of our colleagues with a reckless approach towards their status are leaking sensitive information to their proteges. Incidentally, all should recall the way that accidentally the white helmets put on the internet and video which showed preparation for staging a so-called victim of an alleged attack perpetrated by the Syrian army. In 2011, the chemical serial began, and this continues to be shown to us with the calculation for each new episode to be more resonant than the one prior to it. In Washington, London, and Paris, immediately conclusions were drawn, pinning blame on the Syrian authorities, or, as they call it, the regime. Has nobody put the question to themselves, why does Damascus need this? There were insults against the Syrian government. However, the Syrian leadership However, the main burden of responsibility was pinned on Russia and Iran, and I think that this is hardly surprising to anybody at this point. Now this has been done based on current trends immediately without any investigation being conducted. On 8 April, the Syrian troops sweeping through Al-Shimuna near Douma found a homemade manufacturing area of Jaish al-Islam to manufacture chemical substances artisanally. Chlorine agents of German manufacture and special equipment were also discovered. In Istanbul, the opposition journalist Asad Hamid, who is based, put on his Twitter page a video allegedly from the area of the incident. This has, probably from the white helmets, an unknown individual is next to a handmade bomb with a chemical which allegedly struck the bedroom of a building in Douma. All of this is accompanied by comments about another attack by the regime against civilians. The staged nature of this action is something of which there's no doubt. The trajectory of the alleged trajectory of the bombs is unnatural. This fell through a roof and naturally, calmly fell into a bed without damaging that bed. A wooden bed without damaging the wooden bed clearly was placed there prior to preparation for the staging. And there's an interesting coincidence. The chemical provocation in Douma on Saturday, 7 April, occurred immediately after the U.S. delegation at the Security Council received instructions to convene for today, Monday, 9 April, to convene expert-level consultations on their draft resolution on the mechanism to investigate incidents with chemical weapons. The initial text today has far-reaching changes and revisions. Under these obscure circumstances, of course, we need to get to the bottom of what is taking place. However, we need to do so in an honest, objective, impartial way, without disregarding the principle of presumption of innocence, and by no means prejudging the outcome of the investigation. Despite the provocations, Russian specialists continued their efforts to resolve the situation in eastern Ghouta. In afternoon, 8 April, Sunday, following a new agreement that was reached, the evacuation of Jaish al-Islam fighters resumed. Following the liberation of Douma from fighters, Russian specialists were sent there, specialists on radiological, chemical, and biological protection, to collect evidence and information. They took soil samples, which showed the lack of nerve agent and chlorine-containing substances. Locals were interviewed about the cessation of resistance to the fighters. Not a single local resident confirmed the chemical attack having taken place. A local hospital, there were no reports about symptoms from a toxic substance such as chlorine. Other medical facilities are not located in Douma. The bodies of the dead as a result of contamination were not found. Medical personnel and residents have no information about their potential burial areas. Thereby, the use of sarin and chlorine is not confirmed. Incidentally, the representatives of the Syrian Red Crescent refuted the statement allegedly made on their behalf on the delivery of assistance to victims of toxic gas. I call upon those who will speak against me slandering the regime to proceed from the premise that there was no chemical weapons attack. Sweden drew up a draft resolution to investigate the incident. In principle, in order to conduct an investigation, the OPCW needs no resolution. However, we are willing to consider this resolution. Today, we propose that what you envisage in your project, in your draft, be done. Let the OPCW, which through the the Director General of the Technical Secretariat, Mr. Zumduk, stated a willingness to get to the bottom of what took place. Let it immediately, tomorrow, fly to Damascus. There, the Syrian authorities and Russian troops will provide conditions to travel to the area of the alleged incident for them to familiarize themselves with the situation. Incidentally, this is what President Trump and other Western leaders called upon us to undertake. As for the possibility of a chemical attack being a possibility, this was repeatedly warned about by the Syrians at the Russian Center for the Reconciliation of Opposing Sides. It was stated that in order to take a film of a chemical attack, and I put this in quotes, the necessary equipment has already been brought in. We, too, made the relevant statements at the Security Council. You've heard these warnings. You've heard, but deliberately ignore them insofar as they do not align with the doctrinal views of those who sleep with and see in the elimination of a legitimate government in another Arab country. Still, what is not being looked into is the fact that a significant number of chemical weapons were discovered November, December 2017 in Syrian territory that had been liberated from fighters. At terrorist storage sites in Zaharia and Al-Wafir in Hama province, 21-ton containers were discovered. More than 50 munitions were found which contained toxic chemicals. In Tel Adli, Idlib province, 24 tons of toxic chemicals were discovered, and this is believed to be chlorine. At the storage site in Madamia, 30 kilometers northeast of Damascus, 240 and 160 millimeter caliber munitions were found. Plastic canisters were found with phosphorus substances and compounds. In the area of Al-Sarita, Idlib province, an industrial complex was found for the synthesis of various toxic substances. 54 chemical munitions were found, with 44 chemical containers were found, and these could be used for the manufacture of toxic substances. From the beginning of this year alone, 4 instances were reported of fighters using toxic chemicals against positions where government troops are located in Suja and El Mshaif. More than 100 Syrian troops were hospitalized. 3 March, when Hazrama and Aftris were liberated in eastern Ghouta, fighters from government troops discovered in a tunnel an underground artisanal manufacturing site to make chemical munitions of a handmade nature. And this is far from a full list. It points to the wrongdoings and abuses by the irreconcilable opposition. However, the OPCW's experts being sent there to identify evidence is not something which we see people eager to do. We demand that OPCW verify all of those areas. Access can be provided. Also, information is surfacing that at Tanf, the camp, American instructors trained a number of groups of fighters to stage provocations with chemical weapons used to create a pretext for a strike. It was clear to us that the attempt to shelter terrorists and at the same time to punish the regime so hated by some Western capitals will sooner or later be undertaken. Speaking heads on television screens sought to repeat last year's attack against Syria. Last year's strike, this morning, there were strikes, missile strikes, against the Tifror airfield in Homs province. We are deeply troubled by such actions. Provocations in Duma echo last year's incident in Han Shihun. The unifying moment aspect is the fact that there's a planned nature of these attacks. Analysis of the U.S.'s operations prior to and after the incident in Han Shihun in April 2007 shows that Washington, ahead of time, prepared for its operation. The U.S. Porter and Ross naval destroyers from 4 to 7 April last year, that is when the toxic substance was used in Han Shihun before the strike against the Syria airbase, were already present in the Mediterranean waters where they were engaged in planned operations. They did not enter the ports where an exchange of munitions could have been taken place by increasing the number of cruise missiles. Inter alia, 4 to 5 April, the Porter destroyer was located southeast of Sicily, and the Ross naval destroyer was in passage from the Rota naval base in the area more south of Sardinia. Later, 6 April, an expedited movement of both naval destroyers were reported in the firing positions more southwest of Cyprus. From there, on 7 April, they conducted a mass strike against the Syria airfield. At the same time, the number of Tomahawk missiles that were launched, 59 units, surpassed the overall munitions for 2 naval destroyers if they had actually been engaged in the anti-missile defense operations that had been assigned to them. And for that purpose, only 48 units were necessary. Thereby, U.S. naval vessels, even prior to the chemical incident in Han Shihun, entered military service with fit-for-strike equipment that is an increase of cruise missiles that were more than that were necessary for the anti-missile defense. And this could attest to prior planning by Washington of a strike against Damascus. The fake news on Saturday from Duma are geared inter alia towards drawing attention of society away from the Skripal case, which was muddled up by London, and pulling and throwing on Russia completely unconfirmed accusations, and with the aim of pulling solidarity to build an anti-Russian alliance. Now the English are stepping away from a transparent investigation and putting forward specific responses for the questions put, and at the same time they are sweeping up their tracks. During the Security Council meeting 5 April on the Skripal case, we cautioned that an attempt to unjustifiably place blame on us of having had a hand in the Salisbury incident was linked to the Syrian chemical dossier. Yesterday, this issue saw new interesting developments. For the moment, the UK Foreign Minister Boris Johnson continues to disclose things against Russia and attempt to be witty, and here's the following pearl. Experts of British naval experts south of Cyprus intercepted on the day of Skripal's poisoning, intercepted reports from Damascus suburbs to Moscow, and this is what Times is reporting. It contains the following sentence. The phrase, the message has been delivered. The parcel has been delivered, and 2 individuals successfully left. This turns out to be part of the intelligence information provided by London to allies prior to the expulsion of Russian diplomats. However, is it not clear that there's an irrefutable link here? Is that not clear to all? Syria, Russia, Salisbury. I would hint to the British intelligence services, and I will do so without charge. Another powerful course step. Why not propose that Novichok, which is so liked now, was reached Salisbury directly from Syria by parcel to cover up their tracks? This is complete mockery here. Ambassador Haley recently stated that Russia will never be a friend of the United States. And I wish to respond to that. Friendship is something which is both reciprocal and voluntary. One cannot force a friendship. And we are not particularly keen to be friends with you. We are not begging to be friends with you. Well, what we want from you is really nothing. It's something that is normal, civilized relations, which you arrogantly refuse, disregarding elementary courtesy, basic courtesies. And you're misguided if you think that you have friends. You have so-called friends of yours are only those who cannot say no to you. And this is the sole criterion for friendship in your understanding. Russia has friends. And unlike yourselves, we do not have adversaries. We do not view the world through that prism. And yes, international terrorism, that is our enemy. However, we continue to propose cooperation. This needs to be respectful and mutual cooperation. It needs to be geared towards resolving real, not imagined problems. And you should be equally interested as we are in such cooperation. Ultimately, as permanent members of the Security Council, we bear the main responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Based through the relevant channels, we already conveyed to the U.S. that armed force under mendacious pretext against Syria, where at the request of the legitimate government of the country, Russian troops have been deployed, could lead to grave repercussions. We call upon Western politicians to scale down their hawkish rhetoric, to meaningfully consider possible repercussions, and to cease the reckless spillover of threats to global security. What military misadventures of the West bring about are well known to us if we consider the examples of Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. And nobody has vested you with the power to act as gendarmes, as policemen of the world, and at the same time to act both as investigators, procurators, judges, and executioners. We call for you return to the legal fold, to comply with the UN Charter, and to jointly tackle problems that arise, rather than attempting at each step to advance your egotistical geopolitical games. All of the energy needs to be focused on support for the political process in Syria, to which end it is necessary to constructively pool the efforts of all influential players. Russia always stands ready to engage in such cooperation. To conclude, Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to request an open briefing of the Security Council on the outcomes of the UN assessment mission in Raqqa and the situation in the Rukban camp. As we see the way members of the Commission attempting to create a smoke schooner on this issue, which is a result of their actions in Syria, including the operation to raise Raqqa to the ground through the bombings. No chemical provocations will detract attention from this, from what you have done. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Hi everybody, just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool one of these days, this war is going to end. Till that day.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me also thank Special Envoy Stefano Mistura and Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs Thomas Markram for their briefings. Mr. President, only 5 days ago, here in this Council, we mourned when we commemorated the sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun a year ago. And then this weekend, again, a devastating gas attack was carried out on the city of Douma, killing more than 45 civilians, with more than 500 people suffering the consequences of this attack. This is yet another in a series of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. This is unacceptable. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is one of 9 Security Council members requesting this emergency meeting because we all felt the urgent need to address this horrific attack. Mr. President, we need to reinstate the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. We need to reconfirm the basic norms of the international legal order. We need to stop the tragedy of Eastern Ghouta and the city of Douma. Mr. President, we were almost meeting twice today because one permanent member of this Council seemed not to want to focus discussion on the issue at hand, the chemical weapons attack in Douma. This begs the question whether it prefers an international community that stands by and watches as a spectator, as this member state covers for the crimes of its ally, the Syrian regime. These include crimes that amount to serious war crimes. But this Council should not stand idly by. It is the highest time for this Council to act in 3 ways: to condemn, to protect, and to hold to account. My first point, Mr. President, this Council today should condemn in the strongest possible words any use of chemical weapons. International law has been trampled upon. Silence and impunity are not an option. But a condemnation alone, however, is not enough. Mr. President, this brings me to my second point. We must deliver on our responsibility to protect. Protection of civilians must remain an absolute priority. We call on the Astana guarantors to use their influence to prevent any further attack. They should ensure the cessation of hostilities and de-escalation of violence, as per Security Council Resolution 2401. An immediate ceasefire in Douma is needed so that humanitarian and medical aid can reach the victims of this attack. And humanitarian personnel should be enabled to continue their life-saving work. We owe this to the men, women and children of Douma, of Syria. We owe this to our own citizens. The Kingdom of the Netherlands furthermore recalls that the majority of UN member states count on the permanent members of this Council not to use their veto in case of mass atrocities. The international community should be able to count upon this Council to uphold international humanitarian law and to uphold the international prohibition of the use of chemical weapons, and to act when international law is trampled upon. And let me be clear, we support the humanitarian work of the White Helmets. They do extremely important humanitarian work for the civilians in Syria in dire circumstances. This, Mr. President, brings me to my third point, accountability. All members in this Council regularly stress the need for accountability for perpetrators who use chemical weapons. Yet, this Council has not been able to move forward on this issue for months due to the use of the veto by one permanent Council member. This Council has been unable to tackle this crisis because one permanent member is direct party to the conflict and has proven that it will defend the Syrian regime at all cost. We must intensify our efforts to achieve a mechanism that can continue the meticulous work of the JIM and investigate and identify perpetrators independently from the politics in this Council. The JIM has identified both the Syrian regime and the non-state actor as responsible for the use of chemical weapons. As I said last week, the discontinuation of the JIM mandate cannot be the end of the story. More so because since the JIM ceased to operate, we received reports that the regime has carried out at least 6 more chemical weapons attacks and maybe even more. For those that claim that the chemical weapon attacks did not take place or that they are a fabrication, I have a clear message. Don't veto the establishment of an effective, impartial and independent attribution and accountability mechanism. Let us not forget, the UN is bigger than this Council alone. We have strong leadership at the top of the United Nations organization, and we have a powerful General Assembly. Both have to consider all instruments to advance accountability for the use of chemical weapons. The work should build upon the important work of the OPCW fact-finding mission and the JIM. And we welcome the immediate investigation by the OPCW fact-finding mission of the terrible incident in Douma this weekend. The fact-finding mission should be given full access and cooperation by all parties. And we reiterate our strong support for, first, the international, impartial and independent mechanism. Secondly, the Commission of Inquiry. Thirdly, the International Partnership Against Impunity, initiated by France. And fourthly, a referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court in The Hague as the most appropriate path to accountability and justice. In conclusion, Mr. President, this Council has to act. The investigation by the fact-finding mission of OPCW must be completed as soon as possible. And there can be no impunity for the use of chemical weapons. To do otherwise is to effectively condone these appalling attacks. To do otherwise is to fail on our responsibilities. And to do otherwise is to undermine the international architecture that we collectively designed to stop such attacks. It is time for this Council and the international community as a whole to act. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias al
I thank
representante
the
de Países Bajos por
representative of the
su
Netherlands
declaración.
for his statement.
Doy la
I
palabra
now give the
a la
floor to the
representante de los
representative
Estados
of the
Unidos.
United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. de Mistura, and thank you, Mr. Markram, for your briefings. Almost exactly 1 year ago, I stood on the floor of the Security Council and held up pictures of dead Syrian children. After that day, I prayed that I would never have to do that again. I could. There are many truly gruesome pictures. Many of us have worked hard to ensure that one day we would not have to see images of babies gassed to death in Syria. But the day we prayed would never come has come again. Chemical weapons have once again been used on Syrian men, women, and children. And once again, the Security Council is meeting in response. This time, I'm not going to hold up pictures of victims. I could. There are many, and they are gruesome. Worse are the videos imprinted in our minds that no one should ever have to see. I could hold up pictures of babies lying dead next to their mothers, brothers and sisters, toddlers and infants still in diapers, all lying together, dead. Their skin is the ashen blue that is now tragically familiar from chemical weapon scenes. Their eyes are open and lifeless, white foam bubbles from their mouths and noses. Pictures of dead Syrians who are not soldiers, people who are not armed, people who are the very definition of innocent and non-threatening. Women and children hiding in basements from a renewed assault by Bashar al-Assad. Families that were hiding underground to escape Assad's conventional bombs and artillery. But the basements that Syrian families thought would shelter them from conventional bombs were the worst place to be when chemical weapons fell from the sky. And Saturday evening, the basements of Douma became their tombs. It's impossible to know for certain how many have died because of access to Douma is cut off by Assad's forces. But dozens are dead that we know of, and hundreds are wounded. I could hold up pictures of survivors, children with burning eyes, choking for breath. I could hold up pictures of first responders washing the chemicals off of the victims, putting respirators on the children. First responders walking through room after room of families lying motionless with babies still in the arms of their mothers and fathers. I could show pictures of a hospital attacked by the chemical weapons. I could show pictures of hospitals struck by barrel bombs, following the chemical attack. Ambulances and rescue vehicles have been repeatedly attacked, maximizing the number of dead civilians. Civil defense centers have been attacked in order to paralyze the medical response, to increase the suffering of the survivors. Who does this? Only a monster does this. Only a monster targets civilians and then ensures that there are no ambulances to transfer the wounded, no hospitals to save their lives, no doctors or medicine to ease their pain. I could hold up pictures of all of this killing and suffering for the Council to see. But what would be the point? The monster who is responsible for these attacks has no conscience, not even to be shocked by pictures of dead children. The Russian regime, whose hands are all covered in the blood of Syrian children, cannot be ashamed by pictures of its victims. We've tried that before. We must not overlook Russia and Iran's roles in enabling the Assad regime's murderous destruction. Russia and Iran have military advisors at Assad's airfields and operation centers. Russian officials are on the ground helping direct the regime's Starve and Surrender campaign, and Iranian allied forces do much of the dirty work. When the Syrian military pummels civilians, they rely on the military hardware given by Russia. Russia could stop this senseless slaughter if it wanted, but it stands with the Assad regime and supports without any hesitation. What's the point of trying to shame such people? After all, no civilized government would have anything to do with Assad's murderous regime. Pictures of dead children mean little to governments like Russia, who expend their own resources to prop up Assad. And this Council, which saw these pictures last year, has failed to act because Russia has stood in its way every single time. For a year, we've allowed Russia to hold the lives of innocent Syrians hostage to its alliance with the Assad regime. This allowed Russia to also weaken the credibility of the United Nations. We are quick to condemn chemical weapons in the Security Council, but then Russia prevents any action, vetoing 5 resolutions on this issue alone, 11 vetoes altogether to save Assad. And our lives go on as usual. The Council created the Joint Investigative Mechanism. It found the Syrian regime responsible for the attack at Khan Sheikhoun a year ago. Because Russia supported Assad and his actions, Russia killed the mechanism. We condemned it, and our lives went on as usual. We pushed for a ceasefire. The Council unanimously agreed, but it was immediately ignored by Russia and Assad. We condemned it, and our lives went on as usual. And now, here we are, confronted with the consequences of giving Russia a pass in the name of unity. A unity that Russia has shown many times before they don't want. Here we are in a world where chemical weapons use is becoming normalized. From an Indonesian airport to an English village to the homes and hospitals of Syria. Since the Assad regime used chemical weapons at Khan Sheikhoun 1 year ago, chemical weapons have been reportedly used dozens of times, and this Council does nothing. What we are dealing with today is not about a spat between the United States and Russia. This is about the inhumane use of chemical agents on innocent civilians. Each and every one of the nations in this Council are on record opposing the use of chemical weapons. There can be no more rationalizations for our failure to act. We have already introduced and circulated to the Council a resolution demanding unrestricted humanitarian access to the people of Douma. Assad is doing all he can to assure maximum suffering in Douma. Our priority must be to help the starving, the sick, and the injured that have been left behind. We also call on this Council to immediately reestablish a truly professional and impartial mechanism for chemical weapons attacks in Syria, including the attack this weekend. We hope our colleagues on this Council will join us, as they have before. This is the very minimum we can do in response to the attack we just witnessed. Russia's obstructionism will not continue to hold us hostage when we are confronted with an attack like this one. The United States is determined to see the monster who dropped chemical weapons on the Syrian people held to account. You have heard what the President of the United States has said about this. Meetings are ongoing. Important decisions are being weighed even as we speak. We are on the edge of a dangerous precipice. The great evil of chemical weapons use that once unified the world in opposition is on the verge of becoming the new normal. The international community must not let this happen. We are beyond showing pictures of dead babies. We are beyond appeals to conscience. We have reached the moment when the world must see justice done. History will record this as the moment when the Security Council either discharged its duty or demonstrated its utter and complete failure to protect the people of Syria. Either way, the United States will respond. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie la présidence
I thank
péruvienne
the
pour la
Peruvian
tenue
presidency
de
for
cette
having
réunion
convened
d'urgence
this Emergency Security Council meeting, which France solicited with 8 other member states of this council. I also wish to thank the Special Envoy, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, and the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Thomas Markram, for their important and thorough briefings. Mr. President, there are times in the lives of nations where what is essential is at stake: life or death, peace or war, civilization or barbarism, the international order or chaos. This is the case today after the horrific chemical carnage, which once again pushed the limits of horror on Saturday in Duma. We are aware of the fact that 2 new chemical weapons attack, particularly serious ones, took place in Duma on 7 April. The human toll, provisionally, but still horrendous, is nearly 50 dead, including a number of children, and 1,000 wounded. This toll is likely to be even higher. Some areas remain inaccessible for assistance. Once again, toxic substances have been dropped to asphyxiate, to kill, to terrorize civilians by reaching them in the basements where they sought refuge. Chlorine gas has the specific feature of being a heavy gas, capable of entering basements. For this reason, it is used. And, Mr. President, this is the level of the deadly cynicism that we have reached in Syria. There is no language to describe the horror of the images which surfaced on 7 April, nearly 1 year after the Han Sheikhoun attack, which killed nearly 80 people. What we see on the thousands of photos and videos which surfaced in the course of several hours since the attacks on 7 April, these serve as a reminder of the images we far too often saw, images of children, adults suffocating due to exposure to concentrated chlorine gas. But what we also see are people suffering significant convulsions, these phenomena of excessive saliva, of eyes being burned. These symptoms are symptomatic of exposure to a potent neurotoxin mixed with chlorine to heighten the lethal effect. Overall, as I mentioned, more than 1,000 people have been exposed to this deadly chemical compound. The experience and the successive reports of the Joint Investigative Mechanism reflect the fact that there is no doubt as to the perpetrators of this most recent attack. The Syrian army forces and their agencies alone have the requisite knowledge to develop such sophisticated toxic substances with such a high degree of deadliness, and only the Syrian armed forces and the departments have a military interest in this use. This attack took place in Duma, an area which has been subjected to relentless shelling by the Syrian army for a number of weeks. Use of such weapons, alas, enables far more rapid tactical progress than we've seen with conventional weapons. We are all aware that the Syrian regime has already been identified as being responsible for the use of chlorine and sarin gas as a chemical weapon, and this by the joint UN-OPCW investigative mechanism 4 times at least. There are no illusions as to the sincerity of the declaration delivered by Syria as to the state of its chemical stockpiles in 2013. Unfortunately, once again, we have proof with evidence. This dovetails with the regime's strategy of terror that has been unleashed against civilians. We have already experienced this before the world. At the worst, this is bad faith, and at the worst, at the absolute worst, complicity. The Damascus regime clearly seeks, by stoking terror, to conquer other urban areas which it seeks to control. What is more effective to prompt those who resist to flee than those the Middle Ages style sieges with chemical threats being posed? Let us be clear-eyed. These children who are held hostage are not collateral victims, as is said. These are deliberate targets of these chemical attacks, designed and planned for this purpose, to wage terror. And this is state terrorism, which the Damascus regime is engaged in, with a litany of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Mr. President, the offensive and the shelling staged by the regime as well as by its Russian and Iranian allies over the past 48 hours reflects the degree to which they have engaged in a military race without any consideration of the human cost. This latest escalation of violence, punctuated by new instances of chemical weapons being used, bring us face to face with the destructive madness of a Machiavellian regime which seeks to destroy its people completely, and its Russian and Iranian supporters are either unable or unwilling to stop it. We are aware of the fact, and the Russian authorities have confirmed this on a number of occasions, that Russian military forces have a presence in eastern Ghouta, on the ground and in the air. On 7 April, as the second chemical attack took place in Duma, Russian aircraft were also taking part in air operations in the Damascus region. Russian and Iranian military support is present on the ground and at all levels of the Syrian war machinery. No Syrian aircraft takes off without the Russian ally being informed. These attacks took place either with a tacit or explicit consent of Russia, or despite its reluctance and despite its military presence. I am unaware of which of these two abuses is more alarming when it comes to our collective security. Mr. President, the stakes revolving around this recent attack are extremely grave. This is the latest proof that normalization of chemical weapons use, which is to be attributable not only to a regime that has now become uncontrollable, a regime that continues to gas civilians with complete impunity, but also with respect to its supporters, including a permanent member of the Security Council. It failed in its commitment to implement Resolution 2118, which it itself co-sponsored. and the responsibility, its responsibility in the endless, unending tragedy in Syria, of the war in Syria, is overwhelming. So towards Syria, France naturally turns towards Russia to put forward two demands. The first demand is a cessation of hostilities and the establishment of an immediate ceasefire in Syria in line with Resolution 2401, adopted 25 February last. To date, this resolution has not been upheld by the Damascus regime. We deplore and lament the fact that it was not possible to implement this resolution, which was unanimously adopted, resolution stipulating both the truth and emergency humanitarian access. The second requirement is the establishment of a new international investigative mechanism, which will be able to document all of the factors of the attack in Duma and compel the perpetrators for them to be brought to justice. The disappearance of the joint investigative mechanism last November due to 2 successive Russian vetoes has stripped us of an essential tool of deterrence. For this reason, we support any initiative to bridge this gap. To this end, and in this spirit, France is committed to a partnership to combat chemical impunity. And in the same spirit, we endorse the draft resolution that has been proposed today by the United States. Mr. President, with this attack, the Assad regime yet again is testing the international community's determination to ensure respect for the prohibition of chemical weapons use. From our part, it needs to be met with a united, categorical, and robust response. There must be an understanding, and it must understand that chemical weapons use against civilians will no longer be tolerated. Those who flout this fundamental rule of our collective security will have to be held accountable and assume the consequences. The Assad regime needs to hear an international response. France stands ready to fully shoulder its role alongside our partners. Ultimately, we know that only an inclusive political solution will bring an end to 7 years of a conflict that has claimed the life of 500,000, a conflict that has pushed millions on the roads of exile. France will remain fully committed alongside the Special Envoy of the United States and in line with the Geneva process. However, in the light of this most recent carnage, we can no longer merely repeat words which, without being followed up by deed, are liable to be hollowed of all sense. And so I wish to reiterate here, as was stressed by President Macron on a number of occasions, that France will shoulder its full responsibility to combat a proliferation of chemical weapons. France will be clear. France will honor its commitments and honor our word. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the SRSG and Mr. Markham for their briefings, and I thank him and through him all the UN teams on the ground for the important but incredibly difficult work that they do. As Stefan de Mistura said, this is an important Security Council session. My government shares the outrage that other colleagues have eloquently described today. It is truly horrific to think of victims, families sheltering underground when the chlorine found them. Mr. President, it's the 3rd time in 5 days that the Council has convened to discuss chemical weapons. This is dreadful, in the true sense of that word. This Council should dread what we risk happening, that chemical weapons become a routine part of fighting. As a member of the P5, the UK believes that we have a particular responsibility to uphold the worldwide prohibition of the use of WMD. We agree with the Netherlands ambassador that the P5 has specific responsibilities. Mr. President, I believe that 4 members of the P5 do believe this, but there is one who does not. The Russian ambassador referred to a resurgence of the Cold War. This is not the Cold War, Mr. President. In the Cold War, there was not this flagrant disregard for the prohibitions that are universal on the use of WMD. Mr. President, the SRSG also referred to the risks of escalation and to international peace and security more broadly. We share his fears, but it is the Syrian government and its backers, Iran and Russia, who are prolonging the fighting and risking regional and wider instability. There are real questions, Mr. President, about what is happening in the T4 airbase with its foreign fighters and its mercenaries. Mr. President, we have been challenged today by our Russian colleague to say why we believe the attack was carried out by Syria and why we believe even that chemical weapons were used. The reasons, Mr. President, are as follows. The joint investigative mechanism between 2014 and 2017 found 6 uses of chemical weapons. 2, it ascribed to Daesh for the use of mustard gas. 3, it ascribed to the regime for the use of chlorine. And 1 further use it ascribed to the Syrian regime for the use of sarin. And that is the attack that we talked about in the Council just last week at Khan Sheikhoun, and which led to the US strike, which we support, on al-Shariat. In addition, as the French ambassador has said, we have had reports of Russian and Syrian warnings before the CW attack took place, and of a pattern of helicopters, Mi-8 HIP helicopters, flying overhead, and these are reports that have come from the ground, Mr. President. I've listened carefully to the Russian ambassador's arguments. As I've just set out, we as the United Kingdom believe that the Syrian regime is responsible for these latest attacks. But there is one way to settle this, Mr. President, and this is to have an independent fact-finding mission followed by an independent investigation. As we all know, the fact-finding missions are there to determine whether chemical weapons have been used, and if they have been used, what sort of chemical weapons. But it is only an investigation, Mr. President, that can determine who is responsible for their use and therefore start the path to accountability. I was very interested to hear the Russian offer that OPCW fact-finding mission could visit and would have the protection of Russian forces. Mr. President, I believe that this is an offer worth pursuing, but it would, of course, be necessary for the OPCW mission to have complete freedom of action and freedom of access. That still leaves us, Mr. President, with the question of who committed these atrocities, and that is why we support the US text for a resolution, and we believe that there is no legitimate reason not to support the call for this Council to set up an independent investigative mechanism. As I said before, Mr. President, we have nothing to hide, but it appears that Russia and Syria and their supporters Iran do have something to fear. Mr. President, the Russian ambassador singled out the UK along with the US and France for some criticism, so I would like, if I may, to turn to that. The responsibility for the cruelty in Syria belongs to Syria and its backers in Russia and Iran. Use of chemical weapons is an escalatory and a diabolical act. What Russia is trying to do, it strikes me, Mr. President, is to turn the debate in this Council away from a discussion of the use of CW into a dispute between East and West, presenting itself as the victim. It is far too important, Mr. President, to play games with the politics between East and West in respect of chemical weapons. Russia's crocodile tears for the people of Eastern Ghouta has an easy answer. It is to join us in a non-political attempt to get in humanitarian and protection workers from the UN to do their job of looking after and mitigating the risk to civilians. Russians' concern at attribution for the use of CW also has an easy answer, Mr. President. It is to join us in allowing the UN to set up an international investigative mechanism to pursue who is responsible. And I repeat here the 2 demands of my French colleague, and I hope we will be able to make progress. Mr. President, I had not intended to address the Skripal case in Salisbury, but because my Russian colleague has done so, I will address it today. He asked what were the similarities between Salisbury and Syria. I think it's important that I point out that the cases are different in the following respects. There is a thorough investigation underway in Salisbury. As we have heard, Mr. President, there is no investigation underway in Syria. The British government in Salisbury is seeking to protect its people, as is its duty. The Syrian government, on the contrary, Mr. President, again, as we have heard today, attacks and gasses its people. What the two do have in common, though, and I am sorry to say, is Russia's refusal to assume P5 responsibilities to prevent the use of WMD and its reckless support for the use of WMD by its agents and by its allies. Mr. President, it is not us who want to alienate Russia. She alienates herself by not joining in the vast majority of this Council who want to find a non-polemical way through and to address the use of CW against civilians in Syria. The Russian ambassador mentioned friends of the United States. Mr. President, my government and our people are proud to be a friend of the United States. We stand with everybody on this Council who wants to find a way through the CW problem, to have a proper fact-finding mission and to have a proper investigation as the first step to bringing this dreadful conflict to a close. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, China would like to thank Special Envoy de Mistura and Deputy High Representative Macron for their briefings. China has noticed the reports alleging that chemical weapons were once again used in Syria and caused civilian casualties. This is of great concern to China. China's position on chemical weapons has been consistent and clear. We are firmly opposed to the use of chemical weapons by any state, organization, or individual under any circumstances. Any use of chemical weapons, whenever and wherever, must not be tolerated. China supports a comprehensive, objective, and impartial investigation of the incident concerned so that it can reach a conclusion that is based on substantiated evidence and that can stand the test of history and facts so that the perpetrators and responsible parties can be brought to justice. Mr. President, the question of Syrian chemical weapons is closely linked with the political settlement of the Syrian issue. China supports the Security Council and OPCW in continuing to play an important role as the main channel for addressing the chemical weapons in Syria. We hope that the parties concerned would take a constructive approach, engage in consultations to seek a solution, find out the truth, avoid the recurrence of use of chemical weapons, maintain the unity of the Security Council, and cooperate with the efforts by the parties concerned for advancing the political process in Syria. The Syrian conflict has entered its 8th year, inflicting tremendous suffering on the Syrian people. Political settlement is the only way out for the Syrian issue. The international community must remain committed to the political settlement of the question of Syria and effectively respect the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. China is always opposed to the use or threat of force in international affairs and always advocates the adherence to the United Nations Charter. All parties should increase support to the UN as the main mediator and push the parties in Syria to seek a political settlement under the principle of Syrian leadership and ownership and in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254. Counterterrorism is an important and urgent issue in the political process for the settlement of the Syrian issue. The international community needs to enhance coordination, uphold uniform standards, and combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council. Mr. President, on the Skripal incident, at the recent discussion at the Security Council, China elaborated its principled position. China believes that the parties concerned should strictly implement their obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and, according to the relevant rules of the Convention, conduct a comprehensive, objective, and impartial investigation and address the questions concerned within the framework of the OPCW. China hopes that the parties concerned would work under the principle of mutual respect, equality, and consultation, engage in consultation and cooperation, avoid politicization and any action that might exacerbate tension, and appropriately settle their difference through dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you to Mr. Staffan de Mistura and Thomas Markram for their briefings this afternoon, and to you, Mr. President, for acceding to our request for an emergency meeting. Mr. President, we are dismayed by the general escalation of violence in Syria, as described today by Staffan de Mistura, and in clear violation of various Security Council resolutions, including 2401. And I want to plead here with the Syrian authorities, here represented, and with the Astana guarantors to live up to this Council's resolutions. Mr. President, we asked for this meeting today because over the weekend we were yet again faced with horrifying allegations of chemical weapons attacks in Syria, this time in Douma, just outside Damascus. There are worrying reports of a large number of civilian casualties, including women and children. The graphic material that has been shared is beyond repugnant. We are alarmed by these extremely serious allegations, and there must now be an immediate, independent, and thorough investigation. Mr. President, let me reiterate that Sweden supports all international efforts to combat the use and proliferation of chemical weapons by state or non-state actors anywhere in the world. We unequivocally condemn in the strongest terms the use of chemical weapons, including in Syria. It's a serious violation of international law, and it does constitute a threat to international peace and security. Their use in armed conflict is always prohibited and amounts to a war crime. Those responsible must be held accountable. We cannot accept impunity. Addressing the use of chemical weapons in Syria has become a central test of the credibility of this Council. How we respond to the latest reports from Douma is therefore decisive. Despite the odds, we must put aside our differences and come together. Now is the time to show unity. In our view, the following needs to happen. Firstly, we must condemn in the strongest terms the continued use of chemical weapons in Syria. Secondly, our immediate priority must be to investigate the worrying reports from Douma. In this context, we welcome the announcement by the OPCW Director General that the fact-finding mission for Syria, to which we reiterate our full support, is in the process of gathering information from all available sources. We express our hope that the fact-finding mission can be urgently deployed to Syria. Thirdly, all states, as well as parties to the conflict, including the Syrian authorities, must fully cooperate with the fact-finding mission. What is particularly needed is safe and unhindered access to the site in Douma, as well as any information and evidence deemed relevant by the fact-finding mission to conduct its independent investigation. Fourthly, we need to urgently redouble our efforts in the Council to agree on a new, independent and impartial attributive mechanism to identify those responsible for chemical weapons use. And finally, if the allegations of chemical weapons use are indeed confirmed and those responsible are eventually identified, the perpetrators must be held to account. We're ready, Mr. President, to work actively and constructively with other members for urgent Council action. To this end, we have circulated elements as input to our discussions. We must immediately engage in consultations to break the current deadlock and shoulder our responsibility under the UN Charter. We owe this to the many victims of the crimes committed in this conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Sweden for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank the Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura and Deputy to the High Representative Mr. Thomas Markram for their important briefings. Mr. President, we are horrified by the news of another deadly attack in eastern Ghouta, which happened on Saturday evening. Dozens of people perished as a result of a vicious act of violence against civilians in Duma. Available information about symptoms of the victims confirm that they are consistent with those caused by a chemical agent. Poland condemns this barbaric attack and expects that it will be possible to hold perpetrators accountable. No military and political goals can justify the extermination of innocent, vulnerable people, especially those seeking help in medical facilities. This atrocious crime seems to be a cynical response to the last week's debates in this Council when we commemorated the first anniversary of the attack in Han Shai-kun. Mr. President, we call on the actors affecting the situation in Syria, especially the Russian Federation and Iran, to take all the necessary actions to prevent any further use of weapons of mass destruction and arrive at the full cessation of hostilities in the whole territory of Syria. We insist that all parties to the conflict comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, as it has been stated many times by the members of this Council, as well as UN officials and the European Union representatives, it is highly regrettable that the renewal of the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism was vetoed, thus allowing those responsible for subsequent chemical attacks to remain unpunished. The results of this impunity we face today, witnessing further attacks against civilians with the use of chemicals as weapons. Mr. President, we urge all our partners in the Council to engage in a serious, good faith discussion in order to re-establish an accountability mechanism for chemical attacks in Syria. This is the minimum that we owe the victims of Ghouta, Han Shai-kun, Al-Latamina, and numerous other places where chemical weapons have been used. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Envoy de Mistura and Mr. Thomas Markram for their briefings. Reports of the alleged use of chemical weapons in Duma on Saturday and the videos and pictures that we saw on media outlets are indeed very worrying. It's also deeply disturbing that recently such reports of the use of chemical weapons have continued in the ongoing military activities in Syria. As we have repeatedly stated, we strongly condemn any use of chemical weapons by any actor under any circumstances. There is no justification whatsoever for the use of chemical weapons. Those responsible for these inhumane acts must be identified and held accountable. This is absolutely vital, not only for the sake of the victims of chemical weapons in Syria, but also for maintaining international peace and security, as well as for preserving the non-proliferation architecture. Mr. President, as the Secretary General stated in his April 8 statement and cited by the Special Envoy earlier, any use of chemical weapons, if confirmed, is abhorrent and requires a thorough investigation. This includes the need to establish accountability, something the Council has yet to achieve a consensus on. In the meantime, we believe the reported use of chemical weapons in Duma, as well as in other parts of Syria, should be investigated by the fact-finding mission, and all parties should extend full cooperation in this regard, according to relevant Security Council resolutions. While we all agree that accountability is indispensable to deter and stop the use of chemical weapons in Syria and beyond, currently, as already said, there is no independent, impartial, and professional investigative mechanism that could identify those individuals, entities, state or non-state actors that use chemical weapons in Syria. In this regard, the Council should restore its unity and engage in a positive and constructive discussion that could address the existing institutional lacuna. This said, we all know that the threats to international peace and security we face today is increasingly becoming much more complex by the day. We are seeing that the proliferation of nuclear weapons is posing real danger, and the international norm on the use of chemical weapons is also being undermined. The trust among major powers has also never been, since the end of the Cold War, as low as it currently is. This has enormous implications not only for global peace and security, but also for the transformative agenda that we have set for ourselves in the development sphere. We cannot think of making any meaningful headways towards achieving the SDGs without creating the necessary global security environment. At the moment, we really cannot say that we have such conducive environment for us to be able to make any progress. This Council has indeed the primary responsibility for the promotion and maintenance of international peace and security. Unfortunately, it has not been able to effectively address the new and emerging peace and security threats and challenges that we are facing today. It has been all the more apparent that the lack of unity and cohesion among members is undermining the credibility of the Council. Perhaps we, the elected members, have to look for ways and means of making greater impact with a view to contributing to making the Council more effective. Without dialogue among the major powers to build the necessary trust and understanding, it will be extremely difficult to address some of the most difficult and complex security challenges, including the situation in Syria. Things are in fact bound to get even worse unless something is done. We cannot afford to bury our heads in the sand. The dangers are very palpable. That's why every opportunity should be seized. And that's also why we consider the news about the upcoming summit levels meeting being planned are encouraging. We can only hope that these meetings will help diffuse tension and allow for serious discussions to take place in trying to find a common approach to tackling current threats and challenges. The sooner these discussions happen, the better for preserving global peace and stability, which, as we speak, is becoming a source of extremely great concern. In fact, I'm understating the magnitude of the potential danger we are facing. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President.
La délégation ivoirienne remercie Messieurs de Mistura et Macron.
We wish to thank the briefers for their statements regarding recent developments of the situation in Syria following the resumption of fighting in Douma, eastern Ghouta, and the shelling of the city of Damas following the relative calm that had been seen in recent weeks. We wish to focus our statement on three main points. First, Côte d'Ivoire remains gravely concerned at recent reports about chemical weapons attacks against innocent civilians, allegedly claiming numerous victims with symptoms being shown of exposure to a chemical agent. Côte d'Ivoire reaffirms its categorical rejection of any use of chemical weapons, both in times of peace and in times of war. We vehemently condemn such acts, and we call for light to fully be shed on this with the contribution of all stakeholders being forthcoming. In the light of allegations of recurrent chemical weapons use by the belligerents of the Syrian conflict, my delegation underscores the following. It is more important than ever before for the international community to deliver a strong message, a message to show that beyond condemnations and statements of principle which are customary, to reflect its determination to irrevocably halt this hellish cycle. Chemical weapons use constitutes a breach of the most basic norms of international law. It poses threats to our collective security. For this reason, we must engage in a steadfast struggle against impunity in the use of chemical weapons by upholding and preserving the International Chemical Weapons Non-Proliferation Regime, a regime which is amongst the pillars of our collective security. My second point focuses particularly on the importance of the international communities establishing a mechanism for accountability to combat impunity for perpetrators in chemical weapons use. This in order to end the repeated use of such weapons. In this regard, my delegation stands ready to endeavor to establish such a mechanism. We invite the Council to restore its unity, to restore its erstwhile unity, its unity when it acted to set up a joint investigative mechanism. Unfortunately, the mandate of this mechanism was unable to be renewed despite our concerted efforts. Sir, as my third point, I wish to note with regret the fact that Resolution 2401, a resolution which remains the framework of our collective action, unfortunately, it was unable to be implemented, and the humanitarian situation in Syria has further deteriorated. In the light of the plight of civilians trapped in the crossfire, the urgent nature of a cessation of hostilities is more evident than ever before. Given the deteriorating situation, my country once again wishes to call upon all parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to hostilities, for a cessation of hostilities, and for the parties to uphold international humanitarian law, including unfettered humanitarian access to those in need, in line with Security Council Resolution 2401. To conclude, my country reiterates our conviction that the resolution to the crisis in Syria cannot be military in nature. A political process alone can put an end to this conflict. This political solution must align with Resolution 2254, adopted by the Security Council, and it needs to be shaped by the outcomes of the negotiations in Geneva. My country is convinced that the Geneva talks are the appropriate framework to bring about a lasting settlement of the conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea. Thank you very much, President. Messrs. Staffan de Mistura and Thomas Markram and your teams, I thank you for your very in-depth briefings as received today. The Republic of Equatorial Guinea would like to thank the French Republic and those other members of the Council who called for the convening of this afternoon's meeting. We'd also like to thank the President of the Security Council for having decided to hold this afternoon's meeting under the agenda item Threats to International Peace and Security, the situation in the Middle East. The agenda item is most apt, given that without a shadow of a doubt, the events of recent days in the Middle East do represent a genuine threat to peace and security, not just in that region of the Middle East, but also internationally. From the protests in the Gaza Strip, with the loss of so many lives, to the missile attacks in Syria, and not forgetting the reprehensible chemical weapon attack that took place in Duma, all are situations of deep concern for the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. This weekend just gone, we woke to news that added a further low to the most painful and bloody episodes of the Syrian conflict. According to reports published in the international media on the 7th of April, Saturday, in Duma, in eastern Ghouta, more than 40 people died, the majority of them women and children. They suffocated to death through inhalation of a poisonous gas. President, as we heard in this very chamber on the 4th of April from the Director and Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs of the United Nations, Mr. Thomas Markram, the OPCW fact-finding mission in Syria provides conclusions and recommendations that are not binding and do not entail attribution of responsibilities should evidence of the use of chemical substances prohibited under the relevant international treaties be brought to light. We take this opportunity in light of that last related fact to recall the obligation of all parties to take tangible steps for the full implementation of Resolution 2118 of 2013. Moreover, we underscore the fact that recent events and the way in which the fact-finding mission's hands are tied make it abundantly clear that there is a pressing need for an independent investigation mechanism of the United Nations to be set up, whose task must be focused on preventing impunity, identifying those responsible, and preventing to the best of its abilities future attacks. As far as the Republic of Equatorial Guinea is concerned, no use of chemical weapons should go uninvestigated or unpunished, for which reason the alarming information coming out of Syria, particularly that pertaining to the use of chemical weapons targeting civilians, as we've heard in the case of Duma, which we're discussing today, as well as similar events in the past, must be investigated in an exhaustive, fair and impartial, as well as independent way by the international bodies, upholding the standards of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. The outcomes of the aforementioned investigations must be made public, and those responsible must answer for their crimes before the implacable gaze of Lady Justice. President, the fact that chemical substances continue to be used, particularly targeting civilians, is cause for serious alarm for the government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. At the general debate, the 72nd session of the General Assembly of this House, the President of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, His Excellency Mr. Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, condemned in the strongest possible terms the use, the manufacture, the stockpiling and the distribution of chemical weapons in armed conflicts. It is worth recalling at this juncture that no member of this Council should consider itself exempt from this obligation, an obligation that reflects Chapter 1 of the Charter of the United Nations that enshrines the determination of the member states of this House to forge a world of peace and to ensure the well-being of humankind. Moreover, I would make the point that the Security Council now finds itself at a crossroads as far as options go. We can either strengthen the presence of international forces with a view to future military intervention, as some military powers have been hinting of late, or we can pursue international negotiations, be they on the Geneva, Astana, Sochi or Ankara tracks. We need look no further than the history books to find a plethora of proof that military intervention has never solved a conflict. Rather, it leads to fragmentation of the theatres of war and prolongs conflict, sowing desolation and ruin in its wake. President, as far as the Republic of Equatorial Guinea is concerned, the only solution to the Syrian conflict is to be found in the words spoken yesterday by Pope Francis in the traditional Sunday Mass in the St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. And I quote, "There is no good war, there is no bad war. Nothing can justify the use of such instruments of violence against unarmed people and unarmed populations. Political and military leaders must choose another path, the path of negotiations, the only path that might lead to a peace that is not the handmaiden of death and destruction." And here I end the quotation by His Holiness the Pope. President, we conclude our statement by reiterating the appeal already made by the Republic of Equatorial Guinea on past occasions to those countries and actors who have influence in Syria as well as in Israel and Palestine to wield that influence in order to push the parties involved in these conflicts to move to mitigate the suffering of their people and to push them to sit down to negotiate to put an end to this deep-rooted and serious threat to international peace and security which remains entrenched in the Middle East. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura and Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs Thomas Makram for their briefings. We express gratitude to the members of the Council for initiating this emergency meeting, which we hope will help to take timely and objective investigation of the alleged incident in Duma. We firmly believe that the UN Security Council remains the main and sole body authorized to counter threats to international peace and security. Unfortunately, the situation within the Council is becoming increasingly strained. In order to achieve proper solution of these critical issues, it is of utmost importance to ensure that the Council acts unanimously in a balanced and pragmatic manner. This requires from us greater flexibility, negotiability, rising above our national interests for the benefit of achieving peace and stability. Any controversy with prejudices and mutual accusations without getting the conclusive results and irrefutable evidence will have only destructive effect. That will not lead to the results that the world community expects from us. As for the chemical attacks in Syria, we mourn together with the families of those killed and express our solidarity to them in the face of such atrocities, by which innocent civilians become victims of the relentless confrontation of the opposing parties. Kazakhstan has always taken a firm and resolute stand, uncompromisingly condemning any use of chemical weapons as the most heinous action and unacceptable war crime. As for the situation in Duma, we call for early investigation of this alleged incident and clarification of all the circumstances. The Council has the greatest responsibility to act on verifiable facts, not only before the world community, but before ourselves. But more than that, it is history itself which will become judge to our decisions after a certain time. Therefore, we need to make sure of all the details of the incident. In this regard, we would like to draw attention to the following aspects. First, are there any other reliable sources in addition to White Helmet's claims, and who can verify the veracity of the assessments and testimonies of these sources? Some claim that the number of victims is 70 people, while others report that more than 150 victims have succumbed, yet others believe it is only 25 victims. Only one victim is too much. But today, Russian Federation denies the attack at all. So there are many allegations and assumptions regarding the very fact of using a chemical poisonous substance. Secondly, we consider it is important to take into account the fact that the government of Syria has repeatedly notified us and requested us to check their reports that a number of terrorist groups on the side of the opposition were making attempts to transfer chemical weapons and prepare chemical attacks on the territory of Eastern Ghouta. Actually, they were not given due attention and with opportunities to verify the full facts. We are not advocating for one or the other side of this conflict, but demand only a full and objective investigation on the basis of which we can make a thoughtful decision. Thirdly, we consider it's imperative to have an independent investigation. And here we again recall the urgent need for an investigative mechanism, the recreation of which depends on the leading members of this Council, who must make every possible effort to find a common ground on that. We urgently need an objective and verified information, as well as immediate, independent, transparent, and unbiased investigation before any decision or any action, including a unilateral one, is taken. We fully support the proposal that the OPCW fact-finding mission be sent at the earliest. We're sure that the Syrian side is really interested in objective investigation, so Damascus and the opposing parties should provide all assistance and secure access for the speedy visit of the OPCW inspectors to the incident sites to collect facts on the ground. Finally, we once again call for the preservation and strengthening of the unity of this Council and reach a consensual decision to preserve peace and stability in the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the beginning, we thank you for holding this meeting promptly. We were one of the countries that called for holding this meeting. We thank the briefers, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Thomas Makram, Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Since the beginning of this year, the state of Kuwait has occupied the Arab seat in the Security Council. One of our most important priorities that we have declared clearly before we started our membership is that we defend and uphold Arab causes and give voice to these concerns of Arab states, and we work towards peaceful solutions. And we deeply regret that Arab questions on the agenda of the Council has not seen any real critical or tangible improvement, particularly the Syrian crisis, which witnesses more deterioration. Security Council resolutions on these questions are not implemented. The Council is in charge of maintaining international peace and security, and it is unable to shoulder its responsibility. It is divided and has no unity as it faces these threats. Hence, these crises continue, and the suffering of the people in our region continue as well. Mr. President, the state of Kuwait condemns in the strongest term the heinous attacks by rockets and barrel bombs against the residential areas under siege in eastern Ghouta, including the attack on Juma on Saturday, the 7th of April. 5 days ago, we marked the first anniversary of the Khan Shaykhun incident, where chemical weapons were used in accordance with what the JIM confirmed, and it did identify who used them. And 2 days ago, tens of civilians, including children and women, were killed and injured in attacks and airstrikes against Juma, and many cases of asphyxiation were recorded. And many international reports confirmed that these crimes are tantamount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. Which brings us back to the main demand that we have all agreed on in this hall, that we need to create a new mechanism to identify whether chemical weapons were used and identify who used them and hold the perpetrators accountable in Syria. A mechanism that would guarantee investigations that are impartial, transparent and professional in all chemical attacks in Syria, to maintain the principle of ending impunity. The perpetrators of those chemical crimes in Syria for 5 years have enjoyed impunity, no punishment whatsoever, particularly in August 2013, when we saw with our own eyes the first crime of the use of chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta. We do not want to mark a first anniversary of the Juma attack without a conviction. We want an accountability mechanism established by this Council. We want an accountability that would identify who's in charge, who perpetrated those crimes of chemical use in Syria, and they need to be held to account, be it a government, an entity, a group, or individuals, in accordance with the provisions of Resolution 2018. The Council needs to shoulder its responsibility towards the maintenance of international peace and security. The use of chemical weapons is a true and real threat to the non-proliferation regime. The continued attacks against civilians in medical facilities and residential areas, whether through airstrikes or the attacks by artillery, are all flagrant violations of the international community's will and Security Council resolutions, particularly Resolution 2401, that demanded a 30-day ceasefire without delay at the least. Provisions of Resolution 2118 were clear and definite, as it called for accountability vis-à-vis the use of chemical weapons in Syria, as it is a flagrant violation of IHL and human rights law. However, what we see now is a clear violation of the provisions of said resolution. We, as members of this Council, cannot accept the status quo. The continued use of chemical weapons in Syria. It is another disappointment for the Syrian people. We were not able to end their suffering in the use of these weapons in Syria. Mr. President, this Council shoulders a collective responsibility. The Syrian people are sick and tired of following meetings of this Council without seeing tangible results on the ground. This Council was able, at many points in time in this particular bloody conflict, was able to reach a unified position to end the crisis. We need to overcome our political differences and establish a new accountability mechanism in Syria that has professionalism, credibility, and impartiality. And these elements are available in the American draft resolution under discussion, which includes updates on the Douma incident. We call all members of the Council to build on this draft as a good basis for any negotiation on a future mechanism. We continue to look for a political solution as the only means to end the crisis in all its dimensions. The political roadmap is clear and agreed upon based on the Geneva I communiqué and Resolution 2254, and in a way that would maintain the sovereignty, independence, and unity of Syria and meet the aspirations of the Syrian people in a decent life. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Thank you very much, President. We're grateful for the briefings that we've heard from Mr. Staffan de Mistura, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and from Mr. Thomas Markram, the Deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. President, we would like to begin by expressing our deep-rooted alarm in light of the latest reports of the alleged use of chemical weapons in the city of Douma. Bolivia would like to reiterate its condemnation of the use of chemical weapons or agents as weapons because we consider they an unjustifiable act and a criminal act as well. We believe that there can never be a justification for the use of these weapons or agents, irrespective of the circumstances or irrespective of by whom they are used, as they constitute a serious crime under international law and a serious threat to international peace and security. We believe that the fact-finding mission, in line with its mandate, should, in the most methodological and objective way, verify the use of these chemical weapons. Should their use be verified, then their use must be transparently investigated in order to ensure that the perpetrators can be identified and they can be tried by the appropriate bodies in order to ensure that there is no impunity. We need a representative, independent, international investigative body that can carry out a credible and conclusive investigation. And that is a major challenge before all of us. We must ensure that we live up to a responsibility of not politicizing the work of this Security Council nor exploiting it for our own ends. President, we regret the fact that to date there are still obstacles that hamper the full implementation of Resolution 2401, and we call upon all stakeholders to spare no effort in order to ensure the full and effective implementation of said resolution across the entire Syrian territory. We decry the ongoing shelling and indiscriminate attacks, destroying mainly civilian infrastructure such as health facilities. We also condemn any military activity in residential areas. Such actions only lead to further displacement, injury, and increase the number of dead, adding to the already heavy toll of 500,000 dead as a result of the situation. We call upon all parties to guarantee respect for international humanitarian law, international human rights law, including humanitarian access across Syria, to all persons in need in line with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. President, we reiterate that the conflict in Syria is not one that can be solved militarily. The only solution is through an inclusive political process which involves dialogue and negotiation, which is led for and by the Syrian people. This will allow for sustainable peace to be achieved in that country without any outside pressure or meddling, in line with the provisions of Resolution 2554. We reject any attempts to introduce fragmentation or sectarianism in Syria. President, Bolivia would like to make it clear once again that we reject the use of force or the threat of the use of force. We also reject the pursuit of any unilateral course of action, given that such unilateral courses of action are illegal and contravene the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Moreover, they undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and they also move us further away from any political solution. President, as my final point, on the events in Salisbury, we would like to reiterate the need for an independent, transparent and depoliticized investigation to take place in line with the prevailing standards and norms of international law, particularly within the framework of the Chemical Weapons Convention. We believe that cooperation of the relevant parties in the Salisbury case is vital for headway to be made through the relevant diplomatic channels as we seek to solve this event and to strengthen, as we so do, the non-proliferation regime. Thank you very much, President. I thank the representative of Bolivia for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my national capacity. We would like to thank Messrs. Staffan de Mistura and Thomas Markram for the information that they have shared with the Council. Peru expresses its deep-rooted concern in the wake of fresh reports on the use of chemical weapons targeting civilians in Syria, including minors, this time in Duma. We underscore that, by way of response, there is a pressing need for an in-depth investigation. Peru condemns any use of chemical weapons wheresoever such use occurs. We would recall the fact that such use constitutes an atrocity crime, a threat to the maintenance of international peace and security, and such use of chemical weapons also violates the relevant non-proliferation regime and is a violation of international humanitarian law. We believe that, as an immediate course of action, the Syrian government and all the parties to the conflict, including those countries with influence that they can wield on the ground, must abide by and implement the humanitarian ceasefire ordered by this Council through Resolution 2401. Said parties must also cooperate with the fact-finding mission dispatched by the OPCW. To that latter end, we once again highlight the need to endow ourselves with an independent and impartial mechanism to attribute responsibilities. Investigations must lead to the trial and punishment of perpetrators. The members of this Security Council cannot countenance impunity. We also feel it worth recalling that any response to the Syrian conflict and to the atrocities therein must be pursued in line with the Charter of the United Nations and guided by that framework. Peru therefore opposes any use or threat of use of force that violates international law. We would like to reiterate our alarm in light of the worrying consequences that the continuation of the unbridled barbarity witnessed in the Syrian conflict represent for stability in the Middle East and for the wider international order based as it is on the minimum standards of humanity and peaceful coexistence. By that same token, I wish to conclude by appealing to the members of the Security Council to pursue unity and the common good as our watchwords, commensurate with our solemn responsibilities. As far as the Syrian case is concerned, this will entail the implementation of the ceasefire and an effective protection of civilians, as well as the investigation of the atrocity crimes committed and the sanction of those responsible. It will also entail a genuine resumption of the political dialogue on the basis of Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communique. All this to usher in lasting peace that the people of Syria so desperately desire. Thank you very much. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has requested the floor to make a further statement. The Russian Federation has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I, like my Dutch colleague and friend, have 3 points to put forward. The first point is as follows. I wish to turn to my distinguished colleague, the permanent representative of the United States, Nikki Haley, with a request, a kind and a courteous request to refrain henceforth from naming any legitimate governments, from labeling them as regimes. And specifically, I am referring to the Russian Federation. I've already stated this request once already, but Ambassador Haley was not present here, and I requested that this be conveyed by colleagues, and now I state this personally. Next time, I will halt the meeting for a point of order if this takes place again, if this continues. Second, the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom mentioned that Syria is different from Salisbury, and that in Syria there is no investigation, and in Salisbury there is an investigation. We would very much like to learn more detail about this investigation. We would be grateful if you were to familiarize us with this investigation. For the moment, we know nothing other than that the alleged victims of the use of a chemical warfare agent were suddenly, thank God, suddenly turned out to be alive, and it appears that they are almost fully healthy now. However, nobody has seen them yet, and we fear for the state of these important witnesses. For the moment, according to reports from newspapers, we learned that the CIA proposed to shelter the Skripals in the U.S. and to give them new names. The participation of the CIA here in and of itself speaks volumes. However, this also means that we possibly, perhaps will never see these people. Key witnesses with what took place, to what took place. What else do we know? We know about the expeditious destruction of the pets of the Skripals, their household pets, and their cremation of these pets, and their guinea pigs. And we also know about their intent to take down their home, to demolish their home and a restaurant. We also know that Yulia Skripal's sister, Victoria, and who wished to meet with her, her request for a visa, a British visa, was denied. Why is that the case? That's all we know. So once again, I would note that we very much wish to learn more detail about what is taking place. We would be grateful to our British colleagues if they would regularly familiarize ourselves with the course of the investigation. And lastly, third, Mr. President, today we gathered here not to address a situation in Duma. The agenda item is called Threats to International Peace and Security. And yet, of course, the situation around Duma and the so-called chemical attack served as a prompt for this. But today's meeting, what Staffan de Mistura spoke about and what the Secretary General previously spoke about, we are moving to a dangerous threshold. And unfortunately, this is not being understood by those playing those dangerous games and spreading about and disseminating reckless threats. Reckless threats, irresponsible threats. Today, once again, we heard what we have heard on a number of occasions already. None of our Western colleagues wishes to hear and to listen to the objective information. Nobody casts any doubt on the sole version of what took place. What kind of investigation? Why do you need it? You've accused Damascus of a chemical weapons attack, not only prior to an investigation, but even prior to the reports surfacing about this incident. You are not convinced by the information we provided to you today. You merely don't wish to hear this. We already told you there are no witnesses to the use of chemical weapons at all. There are no traces of weapons, neither the victims, neither killed, nor the wounded. Nobody turned to the hospitals. The footage that was shown was clearly staged, which was provided by the white helmets. We demand that the OPCW mission immediately visit Duma, immediately visit to the area of the alleged chemical weapons attack, to interview medical staff and residents, and to collect soil samples. My British colleague mentioned that an investigation alone can determine who the perpetrators were. I agree. However, this in no way prevents you from identifying perpetrators, labeling the Syrian regime as this. These two don't really go hand in hand. The regime, quote unquote, I stress that the regime, quote unquote, I reiterate, we insist that the OPCW mission immediately visit to Duma. The Syrian authorities and Russian troops stand ready to provide the necessary conditions for this to take place. And lastly, with respect to the investigative mechanism in the independent, we also are in favor of this. Let us recall that our draft resolution with a proposal to set up such a mechanism is in blue. And we stand ready to adopt it today, if necessary. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. The representative of the United Kingdom has requested the floor to make a further statement. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I apologize for taking the floor again, but just to clarify, the Russian ambassador's English is far too good for him not to have understood me when I spoke on 5th of April. The investigation that is underway into Salisbury is an independent police investigation, and the United Kingdom will be very pleased to update the Council as and when we have something to say. One more thing, now I have the floor, if I may, Mr. President. The other difference between Salisbury and Syria is that the United Kingdom is a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention in good standing, and the Syrian government has not complied with its obligations as certified by OPCW. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The American representative said that Russia spends resources to support what she called the Syrian regime. My question to her, what about the United States? The United States is spending its resources in Syria on what? To provide food and milk to Syrian children, or to provide armed groups with weapons, armed groups that have committed the most heinous crimes against the Syrian people? Or is it spending resources on your planes and fighter jets that have been so active in Syria? My American colleague has been threatening my country in most Security Council sessions. Does she acknowledge then that her administration does not give this Security Council any weight? It does not respect the principles of international law or the United Nations as a whole? Let's test the credibility of what she presented. And note that I'm not referring to the American administration as the American regime, because it's shameful. We cannot do this in the United Nations. So let's test the credibility of what she's presented. She said this Security Council must act to achieve justice in Syria. Okay then. My test is her administration should allow the disclosure of the results of the UNSCOM. They investigated the presence of WMDs in Iraq for 18 years. This commission was headed by a Swede, Hans Blix. And as you know, this commission didn't find anything after 18 years of investigation or examination. They didn't find any chemical weapons. They didn't find Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. Nevertheless, in 2008, towards the end of 2008, the Security Council, in a closed meeting, decided to end the work of this commission and bury the archives of this commission in iron boxes. And only the Secretary General knows how to open these boxes. He's the only one who has the locks. There was one condition. These boxes can only be opened after 60 years. What is so shameful in this archives? Why did we need to bury them in boxes that cannot be opened in 60 years? Mr. President, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms the ruthless Israeli aggression that took place this morning on T4 airport in Homs Governorate, killing and injuring a number of civilians. This aggression is a flagrant violation of Security Council Resolution 350 of 1974 and Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism. This aggression would not have occurred were it not for the unlimited and consistent support by the American administration to Israel. The American administration guarantees immunity so that Israel is not held accountable. This allows Israel to continue to practice state terrorism and threaten peace and security in the region and in the world. Of course, Western countries did not refer even to the Israeli aggression in their statements. That means that they are complicit and they support this aggression. Unfortunately, my dear friend de Mistura did not listen to Netanyahu saying this morning that it is Israel that launched this aggression. This is why I was surprised when he said that the United Nations is not able to verify the identity of the perpetrators of this aggression. Well, Netanyahu himself, Mr. Mistura, is saying that he launched this aggression. Why didn't you refer to Israel? Why didn't you explicitly say Israel is to blame for this aggression? This Israeli aggression is an indirect response to the successes of the Syrian Arab Army. The army succeeded in expelling armed terrorist groups from the suburbs of Damascus, rural Damascus, and other Syrian territory. Those groups have been shelling the Syrian people, kidnapping civilians, detaining them, using them as human shields. Damascus alone was targeted by 3,000 missiles within 3 months, killing 155 and injuring 865 civilians, most of them women and children. The Syrian government stresses that the repeated Israeli aggressions did not and will not protect Israeli agents from terrorist groups. They also will not and did not divert the attention of the Syrian Arab Army from the decisive military victory over terrorists. Mr. President, the American anti-racism activist Martin Luther King said, and I quote, "A lie is like a snowball. The further you roll it, the bigger it becomes." End of quote. It seems that this wise saying holds true at any time and at any place. The governments of some countries are lying incessantly. Fortunately, though, they're not quite perfecting the details of their web of lies. Just as the famous character of Baron Münchhausen in German literature. Mr. President, some permanent members have become professional liars, and this in itself is a weapon of mass destruction. Through lying, Israel was occupied. Through lying, Palestine was occupied. Through lying, they fueled the war in the Korean Peninsula. Through lying, they invaded Vietnam. Through lying, they invaded Grenada. Through lying, they occupied Iraq. Through lying, they destroyed Libya. Through lying, they established Takfiri terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, Jaish al-Islam, and the list goes on. And through lying, these countries are trying to defeat Syria and prepare the ground for an aggression. It is worthy to note that the statement, the negative statement of the U.S. representative is in contradiction with a statement made by General Matthews, Defense Secretary. He said in an interview with Newsweek 2 days ago with the journalist Ian Winke,
هذا الصحفي وضع عنوانا للمقابلة مع وزير الدفاع الأمريكي ماتيس.
This journalist used a title for this interview. I will read it out in English.
Now, Mattis admits there was no evidence President Assad used poison gas on his own people. هذا ليس وزير دفاع سوريا.
This is not the Syrian defense minister, it's the American defense secretary. How coherent is this administration? Mr. President, on the 10th of December 2012, so 6 years ago, we conveyed a formal letter to the Council with the symbol A/67/628. So before the first time the operators of terrorist groups claimed that sarin gas was used in Khan al-Assal on March 19, 2013. We informed you that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have launched a campaign of allegations claiming that the Syrian government might have used chemical weapons. Back then, we warned that such allegations would encourage governments that sponsor terrorism to provide chemical weapons to armed terrorist groups, and then claim that the Syrian government had used those weapons. What happened in the past few years in Khan al-Assal, Al-Ghouta, Kafr Zeta, Latamina, Tel Minnis, and Khan Shaykhun, and other villages and towns in Syria confirms unequivocally that what we had warned of 5 years ago. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France have been so eager to hold one meeting after the other, based on fabricated information. This is part of a deep crisis that we're witnessing, and they want to involve other council members in this crisis. These three countries created in the Security Council since 2013 a big elephant of lies and deceit, and this elephant is living today in this chamber and is stamping with its huge feet on the credibility of this council. It seems that these countries called for holding this session to support terrorists and to obstruct the agreement reached about Duma. However, these countries were a bit late because the terrorists wanted this meeting to be held before they were forced to reach an agreement with the Syrian state to leave their strongholds and hand over their weapons. These countries were late in fulfilling their promises to the terrorists. It would have been better not to repeat this broken record and not to rely on false reports from mercenaries, so-called white helmets, that were established by British intelligence officer James Lomizure. He's British, but his name is French. What proves that these countries were lying is that the residents of Duma left the city safely. 170,000 civilians left the city safely. Those terrorists chose to reach an agreement with the Syrian state as the last resort for them and their families. Buses are transferring them and their families to the city of Jarablus after they refused to settle their affairs and that chose to go to the city of Jarablus. The vast majority of residents chose to stay where they were and to be on the side of the Syrian state. It turns out that allegations of some states, some of the members of this council, on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in eastern Ghouta were lies, just as what we witnessed in Aleppo. As it turned out, that warehouses of terrorist groups were full of medication and food, monopolized by some elements who sold these items to civilians at exorbitant prices. At this point, I have to ask, ladies and gentlemen, did the three countries call to hold this meeting to legitimize the Israeli aggression that occurred this morning, or to impede and obstruct the implementation of the agreement? In this context, I must thank the representative of the Russian Federation that recognized the true nature of what these countries were preparing for. So he called to hold a meeting under the agenda item Threats to International Peace and Security. This is the correct title. Mr. President, we conveyed to the Security Council, the OPCW, and what used to be called the Joint Investigative Mechanism, 145 letters, the latest on April 1st, 2018. 145 letters. And I thank the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, who noted that you don't read those letters and you don't respond to those letters. Those letters contain accurate information stating that terrorist groups, armed terrorist groups, possess toxic chemical substances, notably chlorine and sarin. We warned time and again that those groups are preparing for crimes of use of chemical weapons, and they're working with the white helmets to fabricate evidence, to take pictures of locations and film Hollywood-like scenes, everything staged, all that to blame the Syrian government, to influence public opinion, and to incite against Syria and its allies. This is why these countries called for holding this meeting to create pretexts and justify any military aggression on Syria. It seems, Mr. President, that the directors of this bloody terrorist scene failed to perfect their web of lies. We know that in each of those theatrical scenes on the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government, we note that these substances never find their way to armed elements. It's always children and women. Chemical weapons that discriminate against armed elements, but they love children and women. These substances only need to be washed away with water in front of the camera. Just water, Water heals everything. Rescue workers never need to wear protective masks. And it seems that the Syrian Arab army only uses those substances that it doesn't possess to begin with, because the Americans destroyed them on the Ray ship in the Mediterranean. So the Syrian Arab army only uses those substances that it doesn't possess in the first place. only when it is making military progress. How strange, how strange. Mr. President,
في مواجهة هذه الحملة الشعوى التي تفتقر إلى الحد الأدنى من المصداقية.
This campaign lacks the minimum standards of credibility. It relies on fabricated information from social media. Armed elements have been fabricated in this information. I announce from this rostrum that Syria is prepared to facilitate a fact-finding mission from the OPCW to the place of incident in Douma as soon as possible to investigate and verify these allegations. We agree with the Russian proposal to listen to the fact-finding mission's report after it visited Raqqa. We welcome this visit as soon as possible. I hope this offer does not face the same fate as our first offer that we presented to the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon after the incident in 2013, in March 2013, in Khan al-Asal. Back then, we asked the Secretary General to provide assistance to the Syrian government so that we're able to investigate what happened in Khan al-Asal immediately. It took the UN 4 months and 11 days. As you recall, Dr. Syllström was sent to Syria. It took the UN 4 months and 11 days. That is how the UN interpreted the term immediately, 4 months and 11 days. And when Dr. Syllström arrived in Damascus to investigate what happened in Khan al-Asal, some groups claimed that chemical weapons were used in Ghouta. So Dr. Syllström moved from Khan al-Asal to Al-Ghouta. And just so you know, till now, no investigations have occurred into what happened in Khan al-Asal. Mr. President, today we directly accuse Washington, Paris, London, Riyadh, Al-Doha and Ankara of providing ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, Jais al-Islam, Failaq al-Rahman and dozens of affiliated terrorist groups with toxic chemical substances to be used against Syrian civilians. We accuse them of starting those massacres, of fabricating evidence to falsely blame the Syrian government of the use of toxic chemical substances to prepare the ground for an aggression against my country, just as the United States and the United Kingdom did in Iraq in 2003. Yes. We say to the United States and the United Kingdom and France that in Syria and Iraq we eliminated the vast majority of ISIS elements within 3 years, not within 30 years, as Mr. Obama has said, within 3 years and not within 30 years, as these countries had planned to justify undermining the stability of the region. Yes, we say to Saudi Arabia today that we eliminated its terrorist tentacles in eastern Ghouta, and I mean Jaish al-Islam gangs. Yes, we say to Qatar and Turkey that we eliminated their terrorist tentacles in eastern Ghouta, and I mean and Failaq al-Rahman gangs. And I say to all those who exported to us armed, moderate, genetically modified opposition that we eliminated these toxic exports, and we call upon those exporters to bear the consequences of their actions, as some elements who survived would return to their original countries. It is very simple, really. Let me just say that on our borders with Turkey and in the separation zone with in Golan, we still have tens of thousands of good, moderate terrorists with their light weapons, long beards, black banners, and white helmets. Whoever wants to adopt them, please submit an application to their operators. They're ready. They're ready to be adopted. They can go to the West, they can go to Europe as refugees. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic stresses once again that it does not possess any chemical weapons of any type, including chlorine, and we condemn once again the use of chemical weapons at any time and anywhere and under any circumstances. My country, Syria, stresses its unlimited cooperation with the OPCW to fulfill the commitments stated in the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and Use of Chemical Weapons. The Russian Center for Reconciliation in Syria announced today that military experts have carried out investigations in Duma, and these investigations suggest that there are no signs of the use of chemical weapons there. And while treating the sick that are being treated in the hospitals of Duma, Russian doctors have proven that these patients have not been subjected to any chemical substance. So what we're witnessing here is really a Hollywood scene. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. This meeting stands adjourned.
Hi everybody, just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool, Wednesdays. This war is going to end. Till that day.